System access refers to the capability that restricts access to business applications, mobile devices, systems, and networks to authorized individuals for specific business purposes. Let's first watch an introduction video.
Okay, so first and foremost, let's define what the differentiation is between identification, authentication, and authorization. Okay, you may or may not be familiar with the terms. Sometimes they're used interchangeably, but there really are three discrete things. So, what's the difference? Identification is who you are. Sounds like a no-brainer, but in a nutshell, that's what it is. And that means basically labeling a person via a username, a security ID, via smart card, PIV, so on and so forth. We'll cover each of these in more detail in just a few moments. All right, but basically who that person is, what we label that person as. Next is authentication, and that is actually proving who you are. And that can be a username password combo, a PIN, an OTP or a one-time password, biometric data, things along these lines. Basically, okay, you say I'm so-and-so or I say I'm so-and-so. Anybody could call themselves anything, but how do you prove that? And that's by authenticating. And then we have authorizations, and that deals with permissions. So once you've said who you are and we've authenticated, okay, we've proved who we are, now what can I do? So once I've proved that I am administrator, what rights and permissions do I have on that system or on that network? So that's really what that points to, what you're allowed to access once you're authenticated. Okay, authorization happens after authentication.
Generally, system access consists of three distinct functions, which are authentication, authorization, and access control. Authentication is about varying the identity of a user, process, or device. It is a prerequisite to allowing access to resources in an information system. This function is often referred to as user authentication, to distinguish it from message authentication or data authentication. The second function is authorization. In the context of system access, authorization is the granting of access or other rights to a user, program, or process to access system resources. It defines what an individual or program can do after successful authentication. Finally, access control refers to the process of granting or denying specific requests for accessing or using information and related information processing services. It also includes for granting requests for entering specific physical facilities. In short, access control ensures that access to assets is authorized and restricted based on business and security requirements. This diagram here on this slide shows these three functions. All the elements in the dashed lines are referred to as access control. It denies access to unauthorized users and limits the activities of legitimate users to only the actions that they are allowed to perform. The authentication function establishes the identity of the user. It maintains an authorization database that defines the access privileges for each user. In addition, the access control function consults the authorization database and uses an access control policy. The policy specifies how a user's privileges are to be mapped into the allowed actions for specific data items or other resources. User authentication is one of the most complex and challenging security functions. There are a wide variety of methods for authenticating users with associated threats, risks, and countermeasures. There are three general authentication factors, including password, hardware token, and biometric. We'll discuss each factor in later slides. In most computer security contexts, user authentication is a fundamental building block and the primary line of defense. It is the basis for most types of access control and user accountability. Especially user authentication covers two functions. The first function is the identification step. The identification step involves presenting an identifier to the security system. And the second function, verification step, involves presenting and generating authentication information that corroborates the binding between the entity and the identifier. The National Institute of Standard and Technology special publication, Digital Identity Guidelines, defines a general model for user authentication that involves a number of entities and procedures. 6 entities are involved in this model, including applicant, subscriber, claimant, relying party, credential service provider, and verifier. And the process is the following. So first, an applicant presents the evidence of possession of his or her digital identity to the credential service provider. The credential service provider is a trusted entity who issues or registers the subscriber authenticators. Upon successful proofing by the credential service provider, the applicant becomes a subscriber. Then the credential service provider issues some form of electronic credential to the subscriber. The credential is verified when presented to the verifier in the authentication transaction. Once a user is registered as a subscriber, the authentication process takes place between the subscriber and one or more systems that performs authentication. The party to be authenticated is called a claimant, and the party verifying the identity is called a verifier. When the claimant successfully demonstrates possession and control of an authenticator to the verifier through the authentication protocol, the verifier verifies that the claimant is the subscriber named in the corresponding credential. Then the verifier passes the assertion about the identity of the subscriber to the relying party. The relying party uses the authenticated information provided by the verifier to make access control or authorization decisions. In some cases, the verifier interacts with the credential service provider to access the credential that binds the subscriber's identity and the authenticator, and to optionally obtain claimant attributes. In other cases, the verifier does not need to communicate in real time with the credential service provider to complete the authentication activity. Finally, once the authentication process is completed, the claimant becomes an authenticated user, and an authentication session is established between the user and the relying party. There are three general means of authenticating a user's identity. They are called authentication factors. They can be used alone or in combination. The first one is knowledge factor. According to knowledge factor authentication, the user must demonstrate knowledge of secret information such as passwords or personal identification numbers. The second one is possession factor, something that the individual possesses. The authorized user must present a physical authenticator called token to connect to the client computer or portal. Possession factor fall into two categories. Connected hardware tokens refer to items that connect to a computer logically or physically in order to authenticate identity. Items such as smart cards or wireless tags are common connected tokens used to serve as possession factors. The second category is disconnected hardware tokens, which indicate items that do not directly connect to the client computer, but instead require input from the individual attempt to sign in. Typically, a disconnected hardware token device uses a built-in screen to display authentication data that are then utilized by the user to sign in. Finally, inherent factors is about something that an individual is or does. There are characteristics called biometrics that are unique or almost unique to an individual. This includes static biometrics such as fingerprint and face, and dynamic biometrics such as voice and handwriting. If properly implemented and used, all these methods provide secure user authentication. However, each method has limitation, which is summarized here on this table. First, we'll introduce password-based authentication. Virtually all multi-user systems require not only a user to provide identifier, but also a password. A password is widely used line of defense against intruders. The ID provides security in several ways. It determines whether the user is authorized to gain access to the system and the privileges accorded to the user. It is also used for discretionary access control, whether the user is granted permission to access organization's assets. Passwords are the ubiquitous part of the digital age. They are the key to unlocking our online profiles that are hosted across a lot of systems and websites. However, many security experts have long recognized several issues regarding passwords. Let's first watch a video regarding these issues.
You know, we've been hearing a lot about cybersecurity lately, largely because of what happened to Sony. Companies and individuals are more concerned about the safety and privacy of their information than ever. President Obama has unveiled a number of new proposals this week to crack down on hackers, and he plans to address this in the State of the Union speech on Tuesday. And it's great that the government is working on this, but the truth of the matter is we need to do a better job of protecting ourselves. You know, the most popular password in the United States is password 123. And as long as that's the case, we're vulnerable. So today we sent a camera out on the Hollywood Boulevard to help people by asking them to tell us their password. And this is how that went.
We're talking about cybersecurity today and how safe people's passwords are. What is one of your online passwords currently?
It is my dog's name and the year I graduated from high school.
Oh, what kind of dog do you have?
I have a Chihuahua Papillon.
And what's its name?
Jameson.
Jameson. And where'd you go to school?
I went to school back in Greensburg, Pennsylvania.
What school?
Hempfield Area Senior High School.
Oh, when did you graduate?
In 2009.
Oh, great.
It's like my cat's name and then just like a random number.
Okay. Has you had this cat for a while?
Yeah, she's my childhood pet.
Aw. And what's her name?
Her name is Jolie.
Jolie. So like a password of yours would be Jolie and then a number.
Yeah.
Like number 1?
Like my birthday.
Oh, when is your birthday?
June 12th.
Oh, nice. And what year were you born?
95.
Oh, great. So Jolie 6 12
Nine.
95.
Yes.
Got it.
There are several attack strategies and countermeasures listed here on this slide. Despite the many security vulnerabilities of passwords, they remain the most commonly used user authentication technique, and this is unlikely to change in the foreseeable future. Some of the reasons for the persistent popularity of passwords include other authentication methods such as fingerprint are not popular yet, and also physical tokens such as smart cards are expensive and inconvenient to carry around. A widely used password security technique is the use of hashed passwords and salt value. Let's first watch a video that introduces these two concepts.
You might have found out that there is a website that checks if your online accounts have been compromised by hackers. So you enter in your email address and oh no, you have been pwned. Hackers now know the passwords that you used on all these services. But do they really know your password? Well, as it turns out, that might not actually be the case. And to understand why, let's take a look at what options companies have to protect your passwords and safely store them so that even when hackers get access to their systems, your password stays safe. There are 3 ways a company can store your password. They can store it in plain text, use encryption on it, or use what's called a hash function. Let's go quickly over each one of these, and let's start with the most basic one, plain text. This is obviously the most dangerous way of storing passwords. If hackers breach the company's database, they get to see all the passwords of the users. And since a lot of people have the bad habit of using the same password for multiple accounts, it's likely that one compromised password could lead to more compromised accounts. Now, you might think that companies aren't silly and that none of them store our passwords in plain text. However, you would be very wrong in thinking that. Past breaches have showed us that top companies with millions of users weren't adequately protecting passwords. A possible alternative to plain text storage is encryption. You take the password of the user and, before you store them, encrypt them with an encryption key. This would prevent hackers from obtaining the real password of users, but it's still quite risky. Underneath the encryption layer is still a plain text password. And so if an attacker manages to steal the encryption key as well, he can unlock all the passwords. The problem with encryption is that it is designed to work in 2 ways. You can encrypt the user's password to keep it safe, but you can also decrypt it to reveal the password again. Encryption is very practical when you want to share data in a secure way, but not great if you want to prevent hackers from breaching your password. And that brings us to the 3rd technique of storing passwords, and that's by using a hash function. How does that work? Well, a hash function takes an input that could be a piece of text like your password, or it could be a file, and it turns that into a string of text that always has the same length. There are many different hash functions available, but this is what the SHA-3 hash of Hello World looks like. Hash functions are very different from encryption because they only work in one way. You can calculate the hash of a password, but you cannot take a hash and turn it back into the original data. And that is an interesting property to have. By using hashes, companies can verify that you're logging in with the correct password without having to store your actual password. However, they aren't perfect either. Most hashing algorithms are optimized for speed. The more hashes per second they can calculate, the better. And that makes them vulnerable against brute force attacks. By simply calculating every hash of every possible password, an attacker can reverse the hash function. A modern GPU can do this with the speed of 292 million hashes per second, so it's only a matter of time before a hashed password is cracked using this technique. And if that's not fast enough, hackers can also use rainbow tables to further accelerate the process. These are lists of pre-computed hashes that can be used to quickly find weak and commonly used passwords. The speed of a hash function is a positive thing in certain areas. However, when it comes to storing passwords, you don't want this property. And then there is a second problem, and that happens when users share the same password. If both Alice and Bob have the password QWERTY, the hashes of their passwords will be identical. So when a hacker cracks the hash of this password, he also knows the other. Now you might think that's not a big deal because it's very unlikely that different people will use the same password. Well, think again. The password QWERTY has been found more than 3 million times in data breaches. To make matters even worse, here's the top 10 most used passwords in 2017. Not the strongest of passwords. To defend against these types of attacks, we can add what's called a salt to the password before we hash it. The salt is just some random data, but it ensures that the hash of your password will always be unique, even if others use the same password. So if Bob and Alice both use the password QWERTY, their hashes will be completely different. So if an attacker cracks Bob's password, he can't link that password to Alice, and he has to start his cracking attempts all over again.